At 70 years old, Rosanne Cash has finally chosen to open up about June Carter, the woman who not only captured her father, Johnny Cash's heart, but also became one of the most defining figures in her life. To understand the weight of Rosanne's words, you have to first understand the legacy she was born into. Rosanne came from a dynasty of music, her father already a towering figure in country, and her stepmother, June Carter, a member of the legendary Carter family, the very first family of country music. Their names were written into the fabric of American culture, their music echoing across generations, shaping what country would become. For Rosanne, this meant growing up in a world where history wasn't something in books, but in her own living room, at her dinner table, and on every stage her family stepped onto. But that legacy also came with expectations, rivalries, and a complicated mix of love and silence that Rosanne has only now decided to break wide open. Rosanne Cash's childhood was unlike that of any ordinary girl because from the very beginning she was living inside a whirlwind of history, fame, and turbulence. Born in 1955 to Johnny Cash and his first wife, Vivian Liberto, Rosanne's earliest years were filled with the contradictions of glamour and chaos. Her father was a rising star, a man who was redefining country music with his deep voice and rebellious style, but behind the curtain of that fame was a household often fractured by absence, touring schedules, and Johnny's growing dependence on pills and alcohol. For Rosanne, this meant a father who was both larger than life and at times painfully distant, a man loved by millions, yet struggling to hold together the family who needed him most. When June Carter entered the picture, Rosanne was still a young girl, trying to make sense of a world where her father's fame was celebrated by strangers, but brought heartbreak at home. To her, June was at first not the beloved country legend that the world adored, but rather a new presence in her father's life, someone who seemed to carry equal measures of warmth and disruption. Rosanne would later describe those early impressions as complicated. She saw June's humor, her ability to command a room, her deep devotion to her father, but she also felt the sting of jealousy and confusion as a daughter who wondered where she now fit into this shifting family dynamic. Growing up in the shadow of the Carter-Cash union meant living under expectations that few children could ever fully bear. Rosanne had to navigate the weight of the Cash name, the aura of her father's fame, and the looming influence of June, who quickly became the anchor of the household while Johnny wrestled with his demons. To outsiders, it may have looked like a fairy tale union, two icons of country music coming together, their voices harmonizing on stage, and their love story celebrated across the nation. But to a young Rosanne, it was a daily balancing act of admiration and resentment, comfort and uncertainty. As the years went by, she would slowly begin to see June in a new light, not just as the woman who captured her father's heart, but as a stabilizing force in a house that could have easily collapsed without her. Yet even then, those feelings were wrapped in silence, unspoken tensions, and the unsteady rhythm of a daughter trying to understand where she belonged in the greatest country music dynasty of all time. Rosanne Cash's first real impressions of June Carter were not shaped by the glowing magazine covers or the applause of sold-out audiences, but by the very human moments of a woman stepping into a fractured family. June was already a legend in her own right, born into the first family of country music, a Carter through and through, with the quick wit, sharp humor, and unshakable stage presence that defined her every move. To the outside world, she was charismatic and magnetic, a woman who could light up a room with just her smile. But to young Rosanne, she was something else entirely. She was the woman who had won her father's heart at a time when his own marriage was unraveling, and that reality stirred feelings that were far from simple. Rosanne would later admit that her earliest memories of June were clouded by a mix of admiration and suspicion. On one hand, June's energy was undeniable. She had a way of making people feel safe, of filling a space with laughter, of lifting Johnny Cash when he seemed determined to sink. But on the other hand, Rosanne couldn't help but feel that her father was slipping further away, consumed not only by the chaos of fame and addiction, but now also by a love that seemed to leave little room for anything else. For a child still yearning for stability, June represented both comfort and disruption, a paradox that Rosanne struggled to resolve. She remembered the way June's laughter carried through the house, how she could diffuse tension with a joke or a song, and yet those same qualities sometimes felt like reminders that her own mother was gone, replaced by someone she didn't fully understand. It wasn't easy for Rosanne to separate her personal grief from June's genuine warmth, even as she grew older and began to see the depth of June's devotion. The young Rosanne carried with her the scars of those first encounters. Moments when she wondered if June was a rival for her father's love. Moments when she felt overshadowed by June's magnetic personality. And moments when she quietly questioned where she herself belonged. These first impressions, layered with the complexities of family and fame, would linger for years, shaping the way Rosanne viewed her stepmother long before she could look back with clarity and admit the truths that time would eventually reveal. Life inside the Cash household was anything but ordinary, and once June Carter became a permanent part of it, the dynamics shifted in ways that Rosanne Cash would only come to fully understand years later. To the outside world, Johnny and June were the golden couple of country music, the perfect harmony of love and song, but behind closed doors, their family life was messy, demanding, and filled with moments of both tenderness and turmoil. June quickly took on the role of anchor, holding together not just a marriage, but an entire household that revolved around a man whose fame was as heavy a burden as it was a blessing. She was part mother, part caretaker, part disciplinarian, and part shield against the chaos Johnny often brought home with him. For Rosanne, growing up in that environment meant living under the steady but unyielding presence of June, who believed in structure, faith, and discipline, even while surrounded by the unpredictable storms of Johnny's addictions and absences. June could be warm and nurturing, the kind of woman who made sure everyone was fed, cared for, and loved, but she could also be firm, demanding respect and order from a household that threatened to spin out of control. To young Rosanne, this duality was sometimes confusing. She admired June's strength, saw how her stepmother carried burdens that few could imagine, and yet there were moments where that same strength felt like pressure, like another reminder of how different her life was from that of a normal child. June's unwavering devotion to Johnny was something Rosanne could never ignore. She watched her stepmother pull her father back from the brink countless times, standing by him in the darkest moments when drugs, alcohol, and fame nearly destroyed him. That kind of loyalty was both inspiring and intimidating. It set a standard for love and sacrifice that Rosanne struggled to measure against in her own relationships later in life. Still, the tensions were real. Rosanne sometimes felt like her voice was lost in a house dominated by two towering figures, one a global icon and the other a Carter whose name carried equal weight. Family dinners could be filled with laughter and music one night, and silence and unspoken resentment the next. Yet even in those moments of unease, Rosanne could see that June was the glue, the one who refused to let the family completely fracture. Looking back, Rosanne admits that what she once saw as friction was often just the result of her own confusion as a child, caught between admiration and resentment. June was not perfect, but she was steadfast, and in the stormy reality of life with Johnny Cash, that steadfastness was what kept the family from collapsing. As Rosanne Cash grew older, her path into music felt both inevitable and terrifying. On one hand, music ran through her veins, the natural inheritance of being Johnny Cash's daughter and part of the Carter family legacy. On the other, that same inheritance carried a crushing weight of expectation. How could anyone step into the spotlight when your father was the man in black and your stepmother was a Carter, part of the first family of country music? Rosanne admitted that she often wrestled with the fear of being seen as an imitator rather than an artist in her own right. When she began pursuing her own career, she did so quietly at first, wanting to prove to herself that she could stand on her own before the world compared her to the legends she was tied to by blood and marriage. June Carter, for her part, was both a source of encouragement and a looming reminder of what greatness looked like. June never forced Rosanne into music. If anything, she encouraged her to be her own woman, to find her own voice. But her very presence was enough to remind Rosanne of the standard she was up against. In interviews, Rosanne has recalled moments when June offered gentle but powerful advice, reminding her that music was about truth, not perfection, that an audience could forgive a missed note, but never a lack of honesty. Those lessons lingered with Rosanne, shaping her own philosophy as a songwriter who would later be praised for her lyrical depth and emotional authenticity. Still, there were times when Rosanne felt the invisible shadow of June's influence, wondering if her successes would ever be seen as hers alone, or always tied to the Cash-Carter dynasty. When Rosanne released her early albums, she worked tirelessly to separate her identity from her family name. And while she never dismissed the importance of her heritage, she made sure to carve out space for her own artistry. June supported her from a distance, never overshadowing her, but always watching with pride. Rosanne later admitted that while there were tensions between them in private, when it came to her music, June never tried to control her, never tried to make her fit a mold, but instead gave her the freedom to stumble, fall, and rise on her own terms. That balance of guidance without interference was something Rosanne only came to fully appreciate decades later. At the time, it sometimes felt like June was standing back, aloof, or unwilling to step in. But in truth, she was giving Rosanne the greatest gift any parent figure could offer: the chance to become her own person, unshackled from comparison, even in a family where comparison was impossible to avoid. In hindsight, Rosanne credits June with teaching her that legacy doesn't have to be a chain. It can be a foundation if you choose to build upon it in your own way. For all of the love, support, and guidance June Carter brought into Rosanne Cash's life, the relationship was never without its silent struggles, its moments of unspoken tension that lived in the quiet spaces between them. Rosanne has admitted that growing up in a household where two legends stood at the center created a constant feeling of being overshadowed. June, with her sharp wit, boundless energy, and deep well of faith, was the kind of person who naturally commanded attention, and to a young woman trying to form her own identity, that presence could feel overwhelming. Rosanne often felt caught between admiration and envy, torn between gratitude for June's role in holding her father's world together and the lingering ache of feeling as though her own mother had been pushed to the margins of the story. Those emotions festered in silence, because in a family built on music, performance, and public image, certain truths were rarely spoken aloud. Rosanne later confessed that many of the frustrations she felt toward June were not truly about June at all, but about her own insecurities, her own desperate need to find space in a family that seemed too large for her voice. June, for her part, carried her own burdens, constantly battling to keep Johnny alive, sober, and present, which often left little room for carefully navigating the fragile emotions of a stepdaughter. There were moments when Rosanne felt dismissed, moments when she believed her pain was invisible, and yet, as time passed, she began to realize that June was simply stretched thin, balancing an impossible life with an impossible man. Still, those unspoken struggles shaped their bond, weaving in threads of resentment and misunderstanding alongside love and loyalty. Rosanne has reflected on how, in her younger years, she sometimes judged June too harshly, seeing her as a rival for her father's affection rather than as the woman who was keeping him alive for all of them. That realization only came later, with maturity and distance. But in the moment, the tension was real, the silences heavy. Rosanne admits that she carried some of those silent battles into her own adulthood, holding back her truest feelings for fear of confrontation or rejection. Only with time did she recognize that June's sternness was rooted in love, that her firmness was a way of surviving the chaos, and that what once felt like coldness was in fact resilience. In her 70s, looking back, Rosanne has chosen to speak openly about those struggles not as accusations, but as confessions. Confessions of her own vulnerability, her own youthful misunderstandings, and the silent wars that shaped her into the woman she would become. For years, Rosanne Cash wrestled with her feelings toward June Carter, seeing her as both a stabilizing force and a rival for her father's attention. But as time passed, and maturity softened her perspective, she began to recognize the truth that had been there all along. June loved her deeply, in the only way she knew how. June Carter was not a woman who wasted words, nor was she one to smother those around her with constant affection. Her love was expressed through action, through small gestures that often went unnoticed until years later, when Rosanne replayed them in her memory. There were nights when June sat up with Johnny through his darkest hours, but just as often she was checking on the children, making sure they were safe, cared for, and reminded that they mattered even when their father's demons consumed him. Rosanne has shared that June often encouraged her to trust her instincts, to believe in the strength of her own voice, even when she doubted herself. Sometimes it was as simple as a note of encouragement tucked away. Other times it was a conversation in which June would remind her that greatness doesn't come from chasing approval, but from standing firm in one's truth. These were not always the loud declarations of love that Rosanne had longed for as a girl, but they were consistent, steadfast, and rooted in a loyalty that Rosanne eventually came to see as maternal. Over time, Rosanne began to realize that June was more than a stepmother. She was, in every way that mattered, a second mother. It wasn't an easy realization. It came slowly, as Rosanne raised children of her own and began to understand how love can take many different forms. Some of them quiet, some of them imperfect, but all of them real. She recalled how June's laughter would fill a house that had too often been cloaked in silence and despair, how her stepmother's presence could transform even the darkest day into something survivable. Even when Rosanne bristled against her, June never stopped showing up, never stopped caring, never stopped reminding her, in her own way, that she was loved. At 70, Rosanne has admitted openly that what she once misinterpreted as distance or dominance was, in truth, the armor of a woman carrying an impossible load. And beneath that armor was a heart big enough to embrace not only her husband, but also the children he brought with him. In the end, Rosanne came to see that June's love was not something she needed to earn or compete for. It had always been there, steady and unshakable, even if it took her a lifetime to truly recognize it. When June Carter Cash passed away in May of 2003, the world mourned the loss of a country music legend. But for Rosanne Cash, the grief was layered with complexities that reached far beyond public sorrow. June had been so many things at once: stepmother, mentor, protector, disciplinarian, and eventually a second mother. And when she was gone, Rosanne found herself left with both gratitude and regret. Gratitude for the years of strength June had given, for the ways she had carried Johnny through storms no one else could have endured, and regret for the countless words left unspoken, the silences that stretched across decades when Rosanne struggled to fully express what June had meant to her. In the days following June's passing, Rosanne described feeling as though the ground beneath the family had shifted forever. Johnny was devastated, his health declining rapidly in the shadow of her loss, and the entire family felt the weight of an absence that could never be filled. Rosanne realized then just how deeply June's presence had anchored them all. It wasn't just the music, the laughter, or the strength. It was the constant reassurance that no matter how chaotic life became, June would find a way to steady it. Without her, the silence was deafening. Rosanne began revisiting old memories, searching for the moments she had overlooked, the times when June's love had spoken through actions instead of words. She thought about the encouragement June had given her in subtle ways, the guidance she hadn't recognized until it was too late to thank her for. Losing June forced Rosanne to confront her own feelings in a way she had long avoided. She began to see with painful clarity how much of her life had been shaped by June's influence, not just her career as a musician, but her resilience as a woman. In her own words, Rosanne admitted that death has a way of peeling back illusions, of exposing truths we may have ignored while someone was alive. For her, the truth was simple. June Carter had loved her, believed in her, and helped raise her into the woman she became. That realization brought healing, but also sorrow for the lost time, for the moments when pride or silence had kept her from saying what she now wished she had. After June's death, Rosanne began speaking more openly about her stepmother, not as a legend, not as the larger-than-life performer the world adored, but as the woman who had been there in the quiet, unglamorous hours of family life, steadying the ship when it threatened to capsize. And though grief remained, so too did a profound sense of gratitude that at least in the end, she could finally acknowledge just how much June had meant to her. At 70 years old, Rosanne Cash has finally found the courage to speak with clarity about June Carter. And in doing so, she has revealed a truth that had been quietly living inside her for decades. Time, maturity, and the long journey of her own life have softened the sharp edges of childhood memory, allowing her to see June not through the eyes of a daughter struggling for space, but through the eyes of a woman who understands what it means to love, to sacrifice, and to endure. Rosanne admits now that June was more than a stepmother. She was a pillar of strength who held together a family that might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of fame and addiction. She recalls June's laughter, her faith, her ability to command a room, and she can finally say without hesitation that June's love was not conditional or selective. It was steady, resilient, and true. Speaking at 70, Rosanne reflects that much of her silence in earlier years came from her own insecurities, her own fear of acknowledging how much she owed to a woman who had not given birth to her, but who had helped raise her just the same. And now, with her own children and grandchildren to consider, Rosanne sees June's lessons everywhere. In the way she nurtures her family, in the way she balances her own career with her private life, in the way she has learned to forgive herself and others. For fans who have long wondered what Rosanne truly thought of her stepmother, her words now are both a revelation and a tribute. She does not hide the tensions, the unspoken struggles, or the moments of resentment that marked their relationship, but she frames them in honesty, showing that love is rarely simple, that family bonds are often forged in friction as much as affection. In the end, Rosanne Cash has made peace with June Carter's legacy, not just as a country music icon, but as the woman who gave her father a reason to keep fighting, and who gave Rosanne herself the strength to find her own voice. At 70, she has opened the door on the truth at last, that June Carter was not just her stepmother, but her teacher, her protector, and, in the deepest sense of the word, her mother.